The second step in the Better Talks model is called the tension. The tension is when you anticipate and articulate the questions that your sermon is going to address. And this is a really important step. It's your opportunity to let the room know, here's the problem we're going to solve together this morning. Here's sort of the tension that we're going to try to resolve. Here's the question that we're going to try to answer from the text. So 5 tips about this step of the tension. The first thing is this: when I go into a message, when I'm walking into a room to preach, I walk in with the assumption that no one in the room cares about what I have to say. I know that might sound harsh, but it actually is going to make us a better preacher. When we assume everyone in the room is interested in what we're there to talk about, it actually makes us lazy. It can make us actually uninteresting. But when we go in thinking, people in this room don't necessarily care about what I have to say. And now remember, I was a youth director for 7 years, so I was speaking to a lot of teenagers. So in my case, it was actually very true. They rarely actually cared about what I had to say. They were there for other reasons. So assume that no one cares, because if you assume no one cares, then you're going to work on the front end of your message to create tension. And this is such an overlooked part of preaching, but right after the takeoff, as you move into the tension, you need to raise the question in the room so that people will lean in. In his book, Communicating for a Change, Andy Stanley gives a great example about this, and he uses this in his model also, although he uses a little different language. But he says, like, if you're going to visit the doctors because the doctor has a result from a really important blood test or a biopsy or something, and you're sitting in a room and you're waiting for the doctor to come in, and the doctor walks in and says, we have the results of your test, and she sits across the table from you, and she begins to speak. It doesn't matter if she's monotone. It doesn't matter if she's hard to understand. It doesn't matter if she's interesting or not. You're fully engaged, you're leaning in, because you're invested in the outcome of what she has to say. And the tension is our way on the front end of the message of getting the room, or at least as much of the room as possible, to be invested in what we're going to say for the rest of the message. Don't overlook this part. It's really important. And if you're a great speaker, but you don't do this well, it may really limit your ability to communicate and connect with the room. And if you're not a great speaker, but you do this really well, it's actually going to help you. So be sure to not overlook this part. The second tip when it comes to the tension is this. As you raise the question, you want to make sure it's the question that your message is actually going to address. And so let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're preaching a message on the topic of forgiveness, maybe from one of the parables that Jesus taught on forgiveness. So I wrote down 5 different questions that you could use at the beginning of your message during the tension to try to create a little interest in the room. And I wrote it down in the form of the 5 primary ways we ask questions: what, how, why, when, and where. This is a good practice when you're trying to write the best possible question to present to the room to raise tension. Write it in 5 or 6 different styles and then decide which one resonates the most. So for the topic of forgiveness, you might ask a question like this: what should we do when we don't want to forgive? Then what do we do? So just to piece together the last video and this video. So maybe in the first video, the takeoff, you talked about a time that your feelings were hurt, or somebody did something that bothered you, or you did something to hurt someone else's feelings. And then you just begin to transition into the tension where you just say, what should we do when we don't want to forgive others? Or how should we treat people who haven't treated us well? Another way you could ask the question is why? Why should I forgive someone? Is there a good reason why I should forgive someone when they've hurt me and they've not even asked for forgiveness? And now people in the room are going to be leaning in because that's something they've wondered about. When? When is forgiveness deserved? At what point does somebody actually deserve forgiveness, and when should I give it to them? Or the question could be where? Where do you and I find the strength, the character, and the courage to forgive people who have hurt us? So I'm not suggesting you ask all 5 of those questions. That would be a bit much. But write them out and then choose the 1 or 2 that works the best, and then raise the question that your message is going to address. The third tip is this: you actually have to present the question in a way that your audience relates to, using language that they would resonate with. Here's one of the great dangers of being in full-time local church ministry and prepping messages and reading commentaries and reading books written by preachers for preachers, by theologians for theologians, is that everything that you and I read and think about, we bring to the text with us and we bring into our sermon prep. And sometimes preachers don't connect enough with the people in the pews or in the chairs so that the questions that they're actually answering are not questions that the people in the room are asking. People in the room, for the most part, don't come in wondering about the cultural context, although that's important. They're not curious about the Greek meaning of a specific verb, although that may help you in your message. They're not asking questions of deep theological content in many cases. They're asking a lot of questions about how do I get through today? How do I pay my bills? How do I deal with the relationship breakdown in my life? How do I make sense of a world where there seems like nothing is stable? What does it look like to be faithful to Christ in this political climate? What should we care about? What shouldn't we care about? The only way that we're really going to know the primary questions in the hearts and minds of our people is if we actually spend time with them. And so I want to encourage you as a preacher to make sure that you don't lock yourself away in your office for hours and hours to write sermons. It may make your sermons technically better, but actually it's going to make them potentially less effective. You need to be sure that there's a balance between preparing your sermon, but also spending time with the people, having coffee, and not just your leaders. I know sometimes, there's this saying that you should, run with the horses and just kind of spend all your time with other leaders. There's a lot of wisdom in that, and I believe in investing primary energy and resources into other people who can do the same for others. But I also think that there's wisdom in creating some rhythm in your week where you're just with people who are not necessarily your leaders, but they're the people in your church who represent different demographics and different levels of spiritual maturity and spiritual understanding. And ask them questions and listen to them and let those conversations shape the question and the way you present it. Fourth tip, don't bog down at this point. Don't spend more than a minute on the tension. Just pose the question, let it hang, maybe ask it a second way, kind of let it sit in the room, and then move forward. You don't want to spend too much time here. And then finally, the fifth tip for the tension is that once you've asked the question, you want to point the room to the next step, which is the text, that the text has the answer. So you're not going to say things like, when is forgiveness deserved? Well, I know when it's deserved. I'm going to tell you this morning. What you're going to say is something like this. When is forgiveness deserved? Well, interestingly enough, the Bible has something very helpful to say about that. And what you're training your people to do is not to look to themselves or even look to you for their answers, but to look to God's Word. Which brings us to the third step, the text.